And joining me now is a longtime veteran of Washington, D.C., former Republican Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri. He was a member of leadership during his time in the House and Senate, by the way. In the Senate, he led the Republican Policy Committee. Senator Blunt, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Chuck, great to be with you.
Let me start with a conversation you and I had 10 years ago after Harry Reid changed the rules on judicial confirmations the first time. Take a listen.
They decided to change the rules. I suspect that changes the Senate in fundamental ways forever. The Senate in our system was the example to the world that there was a way in a democracy to protect minority rights. To a great extent, that's now lost on these nominations.
Why, when Republicans got control of the Senate next, did they not restore minority rights? Why did Republicans go a step further and get rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court justices as well?
Yeah, well, I think my prediction was exactly right. Once these things happen, I can't think of an example where they're rolled back. Yeah. And I think that week, Senator McConnell said to Senator Reid on the floor, you're going to be sorry you did this, and you may be sorry you did this sooner than you think. And that's exactly what happened. There are almost no instances where you could change the rules in one way and hope that the next Senate will say, oh, that's up to us.
I understand human nature. You're essentially saying you're talking about human nature. You're not, and I get it. But nobody prevented you guys from not going, this is not a good idea. You didn't think it was a good idea in the moment. And then instead of, well, all right, if that's the rules they want to play by, let's play by them. And I think that's what frustrates some of us in politics. It's both parties rationalize an escalation because the other side did it.
Well, I think to some extent, if you reverse something like that that's so advantaged the party in power, the people who voted for you would wonder, well, what kind of chumps are you? You let them do this to you, and as soon as you get in control, you do just the opposite. You know, I wasn't in the Senate yet, but when the Senate changed, I think it was one of the early changes under Reagan. Chuck, the Senator Harkin from Iowa actually moved to change the filibuster rules, and every Democrat who was every Republican in the majority voted not to do that. They voted not to give themselves an advantage that nobody had ever had. But believe me, if the Democrats would have changed the filibuster rules, the Republicans in the majority were almost certain not to change it back. And that's why you need to be very thoughtful when you take these steps into what you think is momentary advantage.
Well, let's speak of a momentary advantage, the Garland decision. The decision not to give Garland a committee hearing. You were in the Senate then. It's not necessarily your decision. Mitch McConnell's in leadership to do that. In hindsight, was that the right call?
You know, I think so. Again, and you've already made this point today, it's all, well, they started it. But in both,
as you said to me earlier, it's always
Schumer,
them, right? It's always them.
It's always them. It's always them. Senator Schumer and Senator Biden, both at different times in the Bush administrations, had said the year before the election, if there's a vacancy, we won't fill it. And there wasn't even a vacancy. This is just kind of a preemptive shot to let that happen. And even if we weren't going to approve Garland, and you could argue maybe we should have had a hearing, I think the way these hearings go, that would in many ways have been unfair to him. To put him through a hearing to know that to not be approved. I actually supported the majority leader's decision at the time and still think in the politics of the country and the way these confirmations have happened, when you have the majority and the president's from the other party, there's just a long history of not filling an election year vacancy.
Yeah, but don't you look at the Amy Coney Barrett thing? I mean, it looked like it was rammed through at the last minute, right? It was exactly, let's take Joe Biden at his word of what he was worried about back then. That was exactly the picture that I think anybody was comfortable with. We're in the midst of a presidential election. You throw that in there where, you know, depending on when somebody might pass away, depends on how that works. Given what happened with Garland, do you see how so many people look at that and think, come on, the rules for thee, but not for me?
Well, I will say in that year, I had more people at the airport and other places mention that single thing to me than I've ever had of any other thing. Why don't you give Garland a hearing? And I think I probably gave them the same answer I just gave you. He won't be confirmed. having a hearing would be a mistake for him and for the country. But I get it. Now, the difference, of course, the next year before a presidential change is that the president's party has the majority, and that's a different circumstance in a substantial way. If you don't do that, let's say you don't do that 2 months before the election, you've always got the sense that your side will just collapse on election day because they wonder why they sent you there if you could have done this and didn't. And so that's a big difference.
You're a student of history. We had to go back. So George H.W. Bush had 2 Supreme Court justices confirmed by Democratic Senates. Do you know that the last time a Democratic president had a Republican Senate confirm a Supreme Court nominee?
No, I don't.
It's
but I do know the numbers have not worked good.
Yeah,
Grover
it's
Cleveland.
Grover Cleveland, Senator. Grover Cleveland. This is why I think you have so much distrust between the two parties on this inside the Senate, right?
Well, yes, Chuck. But you do have to remember that you've got this long period of time from like 1932 until the 60s where there is no Republican, into the 80s where there's no Republican Senate.
We're sort of 2 Democratic parties that could
yes,
control the
that's
Senate.
right. But Democrat presidents got a lot of nominees confirmed, but there was no Republican Senate to really. I hear your example, but I think it has that big flaw to it.
I hear you, but it is an astonishing situation when you think about it. Let me play one more quote from the late Senator John McCain after the 2017 decision on Supreme Court filibusters. Take a listen.
Now that we're entering into an era where a simple majority decides all judicial nominations, we will see more and more nominees from the extremes of both left and right. I do not see how, but that will ensure a fair and impartial judiciary.
And it's that last line. Look, I should point out Senator McCain said what he said and also supported Mitch McConnell's decision. But is this any way to get an umpire? Right? If that is the goal, and look, you didn't vote for Judge Jackson because of judicial philosophy. But should that be the requirement? Are we just looking for qualified umpires, or are you looking for partisans?
Well, I do think in the last 40 years the country changed a view on this, and even maybe less than that. You know, the Thomas confirmation was 48-52. Nobody even considered the 60 vote structure.
Democratic Senate, by the way,
was reasonable. And Democratic Senate, 48-52. The whole idea that it would take 60 to confirm is a reasonably new thing. And again, it happened when Chuck Schumer went to the Senate. And suddenly, well, you have to have 60 now instead of 50. There was great deference given generally to presidents until that became a standard. And then, you know, I also think if Democrats, at the time of the Gorsuch nomination, which replacing Scalia didn't change the balance of the court, if they would have produced enough votes to get to 60 for Gorsuch, who knows if the rule would have, the atmosphere would have still been there.
You think it would have helped
to change
Kavanaugh?
the rule to
you really think?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it would have been harder later in that Congress than it was at that moment.
Yeah.
And I even said to a couple of Democrats at the time, the smartest thing you could do right now is let your members who will actually be helped by this, not hurt by this,
let me go
vote
back
for this guy that's perfectly acceptable.
Let me go back to the last question that I asked Senator Whitehouse, and I'm going to ask it to you.
Okay.
In a different way. Look, we know the Supreme Court's approval ratings essentially have fallen and fallen badly. What would be your recommendation to help the perception of the court?
Well, I certainly think that the court is still such a critically important part to our structure. The court does bring finality to things that sometimes I don't agree with, sometimes others don't agree with. But what we don't want to do is bring the court down with the rest of us. You know, the Congress is sort of an all-time low in public support.
Don't you think the Senate just did this?
An all-time low.
I mean, this is why I put it at the feet of the Senate, and Congress in general, that the lack of Congress, for instance, look at immigration. Congress doesn't ever do anything, and everybody's hands are tied, and the courts have to make decisions about our immigration policy when really Those are political decisions that should be made by the elected representatives.
Well, there's sure plenty to blame the Congress for in terms of inaction, right down to winding everything up every year with some big appropriations bill that only 4 or 5 people have seen the final product before almost the time you vote for it. But I think there's another thing going on in the way we deal with each other as a society. It's easy to tear people down on social media and other places. We've done that to the Congress. We've done that to the president. I hope we can figure out how to avoid taking this court that we all should have confidence in, whether we agree with them or not, all 9 justices, and do our best to try to move forward without bringing that third branch of the government down to where the other 2 are.
Speaking of that branch, look, I accept separation of power, so I accept the idea that Congress can't demand certain things out of the Supreme Court. What do you think Chief Roberts should do about, look, the Clarence Thomas situation, Sonia Sotomayor? We can go down, because you know what's going to happen, as you just described, tit for tat on all 9 justices. We can make them all look unethical and, after 6 months of social media laundering. So what should Chief Roberts do here to improve the perception of the court?
I think he's probably already headed down the road of doing the right thing. A month ago they put out a letter that they all 9 signed talking about the importance of ethics and their personal relationships with each other. Yesterday he announced just this week that they were going to continue to take actions in this direction. And I think the court has to do that. Senator Whitehouse mentioned that, well, the judicial conference created by Congress, manages the other courts. You've got to remember, every one of the other courts was created by Congress. Only one court is created by the Constitution, and that's the Supreme Court of the United States, with the Congress to have the right to create other courts as necessary. And the relationship in those other courts is different than the relationship with the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice and the justices have to make, in my view, this particular decision about conduct and rules.
Senator Roy Blunt, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming on, sharing your perspective, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
You bet.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.